On the 29th of July 2023, in Leongatha, Victoria, Erin Patterson hosted a lunch at her home. 4 guests attended: Don Patterson, Gail Patterson, Heather Wilkinson, and Ian Wilkinson. The main course was beef Wellington. Within a week, 3 of those guests were dead, and the 4th had survived after prolonged medical treatment. Once toxicology identified the cause, the investigation shifted from possible food poisoning to a criminal question. How did death cap mushrooms get into the meal, and who controlled the preparation of that food? After a trial that ran for several weeks, Patterson was found guilty on July 7, 2025, of 3 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. On the 8th of September 2025, the Supreme Court of Victoria sentenced her to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 33 years. The case remains legally active. Patterson has lodged an application to appeal her convictions, while Victorian prosecutors have appealed the sentence, arguing that the 33-year non-parole period is inadequate. This case should be examined as an investigative file, not as a strange story about poisonous mushrooms. The critical points sit in sequence: the invitation, the guests, the meal, the symptoms, the toxicology, the conduct after lunch, the mobile phone data, the dehydrator, the leftover food, the evidence at trial, and the jury's verdict. Considered separately, some details may appear open to interpretation. Placed into a timeline, they form the evidentiary chain that forced the jury to answer one central question: was this a kitchen accident or a deliberate poisoning? To understand this case properly, the relationships must be established first. Erin Patterson had been married to Simon Patterson, but they had been separated since 2015. Don Patterson and Gail Patterson were Simon's parents. Heather Wilkinson was Gail's sister. Ian Wilkinson was Heather's husband and the only lunch guest who survived. The 4 people who attended Erin Patterson's home on July 29, 2023 were Don, Gail, Heather, and Ian. Simon was also invited, but on July 28th, he told Erin he felt too uncomfortable to attend. That detail matters because it establishes that another family member had been expected at the lunch but was absent when the meal took place. From an investigative perspective, the lunch involved a high level of personal trust. The victims were not entering an unfamiliar environment. They were going to the home of someone who had been part of their family. That matters when assessing risk. In a family meal, guests generally do not question every ingredient, examine each plate, or treat the serving of food as a defensive situation. That trust gave the person preparing the meal a significant advantage if the food was intentionally contaminated. The next issue is the period before the lunch. The prosecution did not rely only on toxicology results after the victims were admitted to hospital. Its case worked backwards from 29th July and examined earlier data linked to death cap mushrooms, locations where the mushrooms had been recorded, a food dehydrator, and Patterson's mobile phone activity. This is where the case moved from a medical incident into a file with indicators of preparation. On the 18th of April 2023, death cap mushrooms were recorded on iNaturalist in the Lock area. According to the prosecution case, mobile phone data showed Erin Patterson travelled to Lock on the 28th of April. The prosecution also said she bought a Sunbeam dehydrator in Leongatha that same day. On the 21st of May, another death cap mushroom sighting was recorded in Outram. On 22nd May, according to the prosecution, Patterson's mobile connected with the Lock and Outram areas. These points were presented at trial to support the argument that Patterson knew where death cap mushrooms could be found and had the opportunity to access them before the lunch. That needs to be stated precisely. Location data and iNaturalist entries do not, by themselves, prove mushroom picking. Their value comes from how the prosecution connected them to the rest of the evidence. A single trip may be neutral. A dehydrator may be an ordinary kitchen appliance. But when those facts appear before a meal, later found to contain death cap toxins, they become links that must be assessed together. That is a basic principle in behavioral reconstruction. Investigators do not draw a conclusion from one isolated point. They examine whether multiple points move in the same direction. Another issue was the reason Erin gave for organizing the lunch. Prosecutors argued that Patterson used a health-related explanation to bring the guests together, then served the meal, claimed she had also become unwell, and later engaged in conduct consistent with concealment once police began investigating. Patterson's position was that she had lied about the health issue because she was embarrassed about planned weight loss surgery, not because she was trying to lure anyone to the meal. That dispute was important because it went directly to intent. By the time the timeline reached July 29th, the prosecution had identified three main areas: possible access to death cap mushrooms, a device capable of drying food, and the circumstances that brought the guests to the home. Those facts only became legally significant once the beef Wellington was served. On the 29th of July, 2023, Erin Patterson served beef Wellington at her home in Leongatha. The dish had particular investigative significance because mushroom paste is a normal component of beef Wellington. If toxic mushrooms were mixed into that filling, guests would not necessarily detect anything unusual by sight. The lunch also included mashed potato, green beans, and gravy. Heather and Gail brought cake and a fruit platter. Patterson said the mushrooms used in the meal came from Woolworths and an Asian grocery. Later, health authorities were unable to identify a retailer that had sold mushrooms matching her description. The serving details became important at trial. Ian and Heather ate all of their portions. Don ate his own portion and some of Gail's. Patterson said she ate about 1/3 of her own serve. There was also evidence and dispute about whether the guests were served on different colored plates from Patterson. These details may seem minor, but in a poisoning investigation, they carry weight. The case did not depend on a direct act of violence. It depended on who controlled the portions, who ate what, who became critically ill, who did not have death cap toxins detected in samples, and what the leftover food contained. After the lunch, the guests left the home. At that point, there was no murder file. Only after symptoms developed, hospitals treated severe cases, and toxicology identified the poison, did police have a basis to re-examine the meal as a criminal event. The investigation moved from medical consequence back to prior conduct. That is how this file was built, not by starting with an assumption of murder, but by following verifiable facts. On the 30th of July 2023, Don and Gail contacted Simon to say they were seriously unwell. They were taken by ambulance to Dandenong Hospital. Simon also took Heather and Ian to a local hospital before they were transferred for further care. On July 31st, doctors discussed the possibility of poisoning, and all 4 patients were moved to Austin Hospital in Melbourne. On August 4th, Heather Wilkinson died at 2:50 a.m. Gail Patterson died at 5:55 p.m. the same day. On August 5th, Don Patterson died at 11:30 p.m. Ian Wilkinson survived, but required extended treatment. From an investigative standpoint, this progression changed the nature of the incident. One illness after a meal may be treated as an individual medical event. Multiple guests becoming severely ill after eating the same dish, followed by 3 deaths in a short period, required toxicological investigation. Once death cap mushrooms were identified, the primary question became the source of the toxin in the beef Wellington. At that stage, every statement about ingredients, every kitchen item, the rubbish bin, electronic devices, movement history, and post-lunch conduct became relevant. Death cap mushrooms were not a side detail. They were the toxic agent. They can cause severe liver damage and death. In this case, both the prosecution and the defense accepted that the 4 lunch guests were poisoned by death cap mushrooms. The legal dispute concerned whether the toxin entered the meal by accident or by deliberate act. In other words, toxicology answered what harmed the victims. The trial had to resolve intent. The first major category was toxicology and leftover food. Samples from Don Patterson and Ian Wilkinson showed death cap toxins. Samples from Erin Patterson and her children did not show evidence of death cap toxins. Leftover beef Wellington recovered from Patterson's rubbish bin also tested positive for toxins found in death cap mushrooms. That placed the meal at the center of the file. If the leftover food contained the same class of toxin detected in the victims, investigators had a direct basis to treat the lunch as the likely exposure source. The second category was the Sunbeam dehydrator. Police found the device at the Coonawarra transfer station. It had Patterson's fingerprint on it, and forensic testing identified residue in the dehydrator trays as positive for death cap mushrooms. For the prosecution, this connected possible mushroom collection, processing, and the food served on July 29th. A dehydrator is not criminal in itself. Its evidentiary value increased because of the death cap residue and the fact that it was discarded after the lunch. The third category was mobile phone evidence and factory resets. Patterson acknowledged at trial that she factory reset her phone multiple times after the lunch. Prosecutors also alleged there was a second phone that police never recovered. In a modern investigation, a mobile device can identify location, timing, communications, search history, and attempts to remove data. When a device is reset during a period in which police are examining the consequences of a fatal meal, that conduct becomes relevant to possible concealment. The fourth category was Patterson's explanation for the source of the mushrooms. She said the mushrooms came from Woolworths and an Asian grocery. Health authorities later found no store that had sold mushrooms matching her account. This weakened the accidental source explanation. In a poisoning case, the origin of the toxic agent is central. If the lawful retail source cannot be verified, the accident theory faces greater pressure. When these categories are placed together, the investigative picture becomes more coherent. The victims had death cap toxins. The leftover food contained death cap toxins. A dehydrator linked to Patterson had death cap residue and was found discarded. Mobile phone data connected Patterson with areas where death cap mushrooms had been recorded. The commercial source she gave could not be confirmed. The prosecution case did not rest on one item, it rested on convergence. At the 2025 trial, Patterson pleaded not guilty. The defense argued the event was a severe accident in which death cap mushrooms entered the meal without any intention to kill. The defense also argued that Patterson's lies and post-lunch conduct came from panic, embarrassment, and fear of being misunderstood. Patterson was the only defense witness. She gave evidence for several days, including 5 days of cross-examination by the prosecution. The prosecution presented a different reconstruction. It argued that Patterson deceived the victims into attending the lunch, served individual portions of beef Wellington containing death cap mushrooms, avoided poisoning herself in the same way, then gave false explanations, disposed of relevant equipment, and reset phones once police began examining the case. Prosecutors described the matter as involving multiple layers of deception. The reason for the lunch, the food itself, the claim of illness, and the conduct after the guests became critically unwell. The issue of motive requires care. Some murder cases have a clear motive. This one is more complex. Public reporting has noted that Patterson's motive was never clearly established in a simple form. A script should not invent a motive that the court did not definitively set out. The jury did not need a confession or a complete psychological explanation if the evidence proved guilt beyond reasonable doubt. The legal question was not why Patterson did it in absolute psychological terms. The legal question was whether the prosecution had proved deliberate murder. This is where the file becomes strongest as an investigative case. Its weight did not come from one dramatic fact. It came from the way the post-lunch evidence aligned with intent rather than accident. Prosecutors asked why Patterson did not show the same toxicology profile as the guests, why the leftover food tested positive, why a dehydrator with death cap residue was discarded, why phones were reset, why the retail source could not be verified, and why Simon had been invited but was absent. Once those questions were placed before the jury, the case was no longer a simple kitchen mishap. It became a test of intent and concealment. On July 7, 2025, after a trial in Morwell, the jury found Erin Patterson guilty on all remaining charges. 3 counts of murder over the deaths of Gail Patterson, Don Patterson, and Heather Wilkinson, and 1 count of attempted murder over Ian Wilkinson. The verdict meant the jury accepted that Patterson had poisoned the victims through portions of beef Wellington containing death cap mushrooms at her Leongatha home. Patterson had denied the allegations and maintained the incident was accidental. Legally, the verdict closed the main trial question. Before July 7th, the issue was whether the prosecution could prove murderous intent beyond reasonable doubt. After the verdict, Patterson became a convicted murderer and attempted murderer. That distinction matters. A conviction does not answer every psychological question the public may have. It answers the legal question of criminal responsibility according to the standard of proof. After the verdict, the case moved to sentencing. At that stage, the court had to assess the seriousness of the offending, the number of deaths, the attempted murder of Ian Wilkinson, the level of planning, the impact on the surviving victim and families, Patterson's conduct, and relevant custodial considerations. The focus shifted from guilt to penalty. On the 8th of September 2025, Justice Christopher Beale sentenced Erin Patterson to life imprisonment with a non-parole period of 33 years. The Supreme Court of Victoria's sentencing summary recorded that Patterson had been convicted of deliberately serving a meal containing death cap mushrooms to Gail Patterson, Don Patterson, and Heather Wilkinson, and of attempting to murder Ian Wilkinson, who survived. The court also recorded 676 days of pre-sentence detention. This needs to be explained accurately. The 33 years is not the total sentence. The sentence is life imprisonment. The 33 years is the minimum period Patterson must serve before she becomes eligible to apply for parole. Eligibility for parole does not guarantee release. It only allows consideration by the parole authority if the sentence remains unchanged. The sentence created a further legal dispute. Prosecutors had sought a sentence that would never allow Patterson to be considered for parole. The court imposed a non-parole period, partly taking into account the harshness of Patterson's custody conditions and the likelihood of prolonged isolation. That issue later became central to the prosecution's appeal against sentence. The latest reliable public information shows the case remains active in the appellate process. On October 6, 2025, Victorian prosecutors appealed the sentence, arguing it was manifestly inadequate. Their position was that the sentencing judge had erred in assessing the likelihood and weight of Patterson's future prison isolation, and that this affected the decision to allow parole eligibility after 33 years. Patterson has also applied to appeal her convictions. Reported grounds include claims that the 5-day cross-examination was unfair and oppressive, that the prosecution's closing address caused a substantial miscarriage of justice, and that there were issues concerning mobile tower evidence, iNaturalist evidence, evidence from Facebook friends, an excluded SD card issue, and the jury's accommodation at the same hotel as a key police witness and 2 prosecution team members. The Court of Appeal has received the filing, but public reporting at the time indicated that leave to appeal had not yet been granted. The current position should be stated clearly.
Erin Patterson is a convicted murderer and attempted murderer, serving a life sentence for the death cap mushroom lunch in Leongatha. The trial verdict remains in force. The post-trial phase is unresolved because Patterson is seeking to challenge the convictions, while prosecutors are seeking a harsher sentence that could remove any future parole eligibility. If the Court of Appeal grants leave and accepts part of either appeal, the case may enter a new legal phase. If the appeals fail, the current sentence stands.
The central feature of the Patterson case is not the unusual nature of death cap mushrooms. The central feature is the structure of the evidence. A meal controlled by 1 person, 4 guests critically ill, 3 deaths, 1 survivor, leftover food testing positive for death cap toxins, a dehydrator with death cap residue, mobile data connected to areas where the mushrooms had been recorded, an unverified retail source, and post-lunch conduct the prosecution characterized as concealment. The jury assessed that chain and convicted Patterson of murder and attempted murder. For an investigative video, the final question should not be whether the offender was simply evil. A more precise question is this: in a case without a clear confession, which evidence carried the most weight in proving intent? Was it the dehydrator, the leftover beef Wellington, the mobile phone evidence, the explanation about the mushroom source, or the full sequence of conduct after the lunch?
That question keeps the focus where it belongs, on evidence, intent, and the logic of the investigation.